Hey, welcome back to Spellbound. I'm BJ the Book Witch, and you're watching an episode of Tabled Content. This is where we put two entirely different books in conversation with each other. Have you ever done this? It's an extremely fun exercise for book people. I highly recommend it. Do you ever wonder what Neil Gaiman might think about J.M. Barrie or Lewis Carroll? Not them as people, but as writers? The cool thing is he's already told us. His books draw all kinds of inspiration from classic romantic literature as well as Germanic and Nordic fairy tales and folklore. Or how does Anna Marie McLemore feel about Virginia Woolf? I don't know, but I do know that her contemporary writing style and main characters are very in line with the pioneering writing styles and structures and perspectives from realist literature. It can be as simple as finding commonalities between plots, adventures, or tropes, enemies to lovers, anyone? And then seeing where they drift apart. And I see all kinds of opportunities for this when I see all these beautiful pictures of your bookshelves that are arranged by color. I know that there's no way that all of those color-coded books are organized by genre and then author's alphabetical order. So you probably have two very different authors sitting right next to each other on your very own bookshelf. What do they have to say to each other? Does Paul Coelho have any insight for Shirley Jackson, or is he afraid of her? That might be fair. Put Coelho next to Leigh Bardugo and let them talk about archetypes, and then put Holly Black next to Shirley Jackson and watch the drama unfold over tea and tarot. But I digress. Point is, books draw inspiration from everywhere, and not just in narrative form. Information exchanges so quickly right now through an entire network that is constantly moving, growing, shifting, changing, creating, that ideas that can seem completely unrelated to each other might actually have some pretty strong common foundations. So today we're putting two completely unrelated books in conversation with each other, just to see if they have anything to say. We're looking at How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram X. Kendi and You Are Intuitive by Natalie Miles. So, How to Be an Antiracist. Part memoir, part history, this book discusses critical race theory in the context of Kendi's own childhood experience and how he came to understand, embrace, and then discuss his own Black identity. This book is conveniently organized into conceptualized chapters such as biology, class, sexuality, ethnicity, and other topics of conversation and points of intersectionality. In each chapter, Kendi addresses how he came to be confronted with each topic in his own life, and then provides a thorough historical context to help us understand the ways that these concepts have taken root in the systems and makeup of present-day America. The main theme of the book is that there's no such thing as not racist. There's either racist or there's anti-racist. He explains the histories and foundations of racist policies, power structures, and ideology, and then explains how to recondition yourself to think, act, and advocate to actively dismantle those racist policies and power structures. As an anti-racist, You Are Intuitive is a new age spiritual book on connecting to your intuitive self, understanding intuition as a sense or sensory extension that each person has the capacity to develop. The first 2/3 of the book are practical application and discuss ways to recondition your understanding of intuition in order to develop it. The book provides affirmations for each concept and access to an online portal for further guided meditations and additional resources. The last third talks about how individual intuition and connectedness can serve the collective. What even would these books have to say to each other? One book on history and race and social justice and another on developing intuition? Remember how I said that information is being passed and shared and created so fast that actually, culturally, concepts are building on each other? I think the fact that these two books came out and were published so closely together actually says a lot. How to Be an Antiracist was published in 2019 by One World, which is an imprint of Random House and a division of Penguin Random House. You Are Intuitive was published in 2020 by Numinous Books, a self-publishing imprint. So on the spiritual side of things, we're seeing some trends, right? And I don't mean this month or this year. Let's think bigger for just a second and zoom out our scope to when things really started to pick up the pace. The Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, productivity, this idea of productivity, means something completely different and something that previous generations couldn't even fathom. Machines produce more and they produce faster, and humans work harder and then they move faster with cars and trains and steamboats and planes and the telegraph and then the telephone and all of these ways of getting more and moving faster. The capitalist economy is booming with this new fast pace, and humans are developing ways to think and act and behave more like machines, as vessels for production. And during this growth period, there was a natural response to the overproduction of resources, with a spiritual and environment focused movement called hippie counterculture. There's a lot of love, not war messaging and pushes against the hyper individualistic capitalist worldview with pop ups of communes or intentional living communities. And seeing as I wasn't around back then, I have the privileged ability to look back and criticize, summing them up as mostly drug induced pseudo activists unconcerned with elements of intersectionality and the way that a capitalist economy works in tandem with racist policies to oppress BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But the production and the pace didn't stop, and it reached an apex in the 80s during the Cold War. See, in response to the Soviet Union, to identify as radically not communist, the US had to become even more capitalist. And so it deregulated financial markets, moving the smartest minds of the age from where they had been previously employed developing weapons of mass destruction over to Wall Street, where they would engage in the stock market, creating and perpetuating an unstable and unethical global market, which we would all see collapse on our heads in 2008. But who's bitter? Not me. So as a response to that greed is good mentality of the 80s, came a new movement to fill the spiritual vacuum in the 90s. It was sort of a cultural awakening to the idea that humans are part of a system or a machine. And this idea was definitely expressed through music, bookending the 90s with bands like Rage Against the Machine and Rise Against. The music during this time expresses the intense angst that people felt, realizing that this idea of American freedom or radical individualism actually comes at the expense of entire peoples and a way of life that is unsustainable. It's a pretty bleak realization. And while this grunge phase was mostly angst-based, there were plenty of attempts to try to establish or reconnect some semblance of spirituality or spiritual connection. Bands like Nirvana, Third Eye Blind, or Foo Fighters, the names alone express a dissatisfaction with the disconnect between ourselves as individuals and the collective. So we should all thank the 90s then for their bleak perspective and sharp criticism, because it ushered in the new age ideas and trends that make up modern spiritual practices. And we see that transition, right? Enlightenment is no longer seen as something that can only be achieved by intense and radical isolation, journeying to the Himalayas to meet a guy in a robe who just tells you to shut up for a year. And yes, retreats can be powerful, that's not what I'm saying, but they're not necessary to have some spiritual reawakening. The idea that enlightenment can only be achieved like it's a boss battle in a life video game and can only come from somehow encountering intense wisdom outside of yourself, that's outdated. The conversation now is much more inward. And instead of this idea of radical individualism, it's more about radical empathy and connection. Connection to other humans, our communities, other cultures, to our environment and our planet. It's about understanding other peoples, developing emotional intelligence, and raising the consciousness of the collective together. And this conversation isn't just relegated to new age indie published books. This conversation is happening everywhere. It's in corporate culture training with leadership skills that are based in empathy and genuine care, and entire companies and corporations that have whole divisions dedicated to diversity and inclusion and corporate social responsibility. It's in literature theory where the way that we analyze and understand books through the context in which they were written. And it's in psychology and mental health counseling. This conversation is happening everywhere. This is a language and a lens through which we can view the world with a better, more holistic understanding. Let me just get comfortable for a minute. So when you are intuitive, Natalie Miles draws on this theme and this idea of self-sovereignty, which is really just a term for trusting yourself wholly and implicitly, which is at odds with the idea that you need to seek guidance, especially spiritual guidance, from these external sources. Like the monk in the mountains or the sage in the desert. This idea of self-sovereignty says that everything you need to know is already inside of you. But this theme of self-sovereignty continues throughout the book, and Miles informs us not only how to reconnect to our intuition, but what to do once we get it. The belief here is that if we are all energetically connected, then one person living in their truth, aligned with their beliefs, and connected to both the divine and the collective will positively affect everyone. So Miles talks about the importance of healing the present moment, becoming a conscious intuitive, and then showing up for the collective in ways that are active and ongoing, instead of just passive or rote or ceremonial. Quote, "For as each of us wakes up to our own individual spiritual truth, we are beginning to see that these systems can only exist for as long as we are complicit in them. that while we blame society, we forget that we are society, and that radical, lasting change can only begin as every one of us chooses to enact this in our lives. End quote. So it's this idea of self-sovereignty as it has agency and using it as a power for change. And the idea that becoming enlightened is about learning something you didn't already know before, waking up to the state of things with a more holistic and sometimes overwhelming understanding of the world around us and how it has been built to produce and to oppress. But that once you are enlightened, you're given the tools to stand in that knowledge and to use your voice to participate in the world instead of withdrawing from it. That being intuitive and being connected to the collective means embracing that and participating in real action and change. Individually, collectively, spiritually, means advocating and fighting for new structures and systems that raise everyone up. So what does that have to do with how to be an anti-racist? Well, hopefully you're seeing some similar themes, but we can look a little closer too. So How to Be an Anti-Racist is both a memoir and a history book. Although for a true history book, I recommend another one of Kendi's, Stamped from the Beginning. It's quite a read, but there is a kids version, which I highly recommend. In this book, Kendi analyzes the way that racist power structures were conceptualized and founded, and explains the way that these racist power structures continue to oppress people, specifically Black people, today. So he doesn't talk in a spiritual sense about the collective in the same way or with the same language that Miles does. Truthfully, I thought there might be some overlap here in talking about collective trauma, or the psychological effects that a group or population experience after a single traumatic event, or a series of traumatic events, or a lifetime of traumatic events, or generations of traumatic events. But Kendi did not explore this idea, and at first I was frustrated because so many Black writers right now talking about social justice and social consciousness are addressing collective trauma. But then I realized Kendi is an historian, and he is looking back on his life and the life of this country through the lens of an historian. And as an historian, he knows that there was a time when pseudopsychology tried to weaponize this idea, or the sprinklings of influence that eventually became this idea, to invent horrific and profoundly false biological differences between races. So he may not talk in a spiritual sense about the collective, but he does take a profoundly similar stance to Miles's when it comes to self-sovereignty, understanding your environment, speaking your truth, and being a constant advocate for change for the collective. Kendi's entire argument is against the premise of not racist. There is no such thing as not racist. Things, structures, policies, beliefs are either racist in that they participate or perpetuate the oppression of people based on race, or they are anti-racist in that they actively challenge or fight against those racist structure systems and beliefs. But to be simply not racist doesn't mean anything. If you are actively challenging or fighting against the oppression of Black people in this country, then you are part of the problem, which is to say, racist. Kendi is very clear in his argument, and he's very clear with his evidence and data, and he's clear with the prescription. Here's how to be an anti-racist. Here's how to speak truth to power and continue to advocate and fight for policy change. It's self-sovereignty. So obviously these are two very different books. They're on two different subjects, and they're written by two very different people, an historian and a spiritual guide, and they offer two different lenses and ways in which we can view the world. But they don't have to be for two different audiences because they both participate in a single global conversation. These books participate in a conversation that is saying, guys, wake up, it's all a sham. The power structures around you have been built and manufactured on harmful belief systems that require oppression and silence to survive. And these books are written by individuals who are experts in their field, who are gently saying, look, I know you feel it, so here's how to see it. Here's how to understand and put words around the very real and very invisible belief systems that have surrounded you and have built you. So let me show you, and then let me show you what we can do about it. Enlightenment means to be free from ignorance or misinformation. So it's no coincidence that we're seeing such a deep connection between this understanding of enlightenment and the social radical liberation of all people. So, book people, what do you think? What do you think of when you hear the word enlightenment? What are you doing to fight for social change or to be an anti-racist? What are some things I got wrong? Would you draw different conclusions than I did? Do you like these books? Do you have any other suggestions? I'm really here to start conversations and engage with BookTube and other book people. So let me know what you think, seriously. For For a closer look on these 2 books, I'll be reviewing them in my end of the month wrap up where I talk about each of the 10 great books that I read throughout January. Thanks for watching, and happy reading!